Hello everybody and welcome to the first in a weekly series of short videos designed to help you work on both subject knowledge as well as exam technique. Now what we're going to be looking at here is how to answer this particular 15-mark question. With reference to extracts A and B and your own knowledge, discuss whether the MPC should be concerned about the risk of deflation in the UK economy. Now, before we start answering this question, we've got to be thinking about understanding of the key terms in this question. So for me, the key things to pull out will be the MPC, which is the Monetary Policy Committee, and what we mean by deflation. Now, the Monetary Policy Committee are the branch of the Bank of England who are responsible for setting base interest rates. And when they adjust interest rates, what they're looking to do is to support price stability. Okay, now if you remember, price stability would occur when the rate of inflation is approximately 2%. We do allow a little bit of leeway either side, so normally 1 to 3% as a rate of inflation is said to be price stability, but 2% is ideal. So if inflation was too low, we'd have to use an expansionary demand side monetary policy. So that would involve cutting interest rates. Lower interest rates would raise aggregate demand by encouraging more borrowing, more spending, less saving, and that would stimulate growth in the economy and therefore create demand pull inflation. If inflation was too high, then you'd be looking to raise interest rates. And what that higher interest rate would do, it would stimulate more saving, discourage borrowing and reduce aggregate demand and bring down inflation towards more manageable levels. Okay, so Monetary Policy Committee would recommend higher or lower interest rates depending on what the rate of inflation is. Now, when we have deflation, it's when we have a negative inflation rate. And that would mean that the general or the average price level across the economy is falling. Now, normally, if you've got deflation, what we'd recommend would be an expansionary monetary policy. So what you do, you'd lower the base interest rate, which would in turn stimulate a growth in aggregate demand. Now, the reason why it would do this, if you think about the formula SIGEXM, if you were to, I'll show you this here, this is the demand pull inflation. Obviously, it's quite a scruffy diagram, but it hopefully shows you the point. Now, as interest rates fall, it would stimulate consumption. And the reason why that would happen is that it would reduce the returns on savings. So the opportunity cost of spending your money would fall. So it would incentivize more people to spend rather than save. So it would raise the average propensity to consume. What it would also do is to make borrowing cheaper. Remember, the interest rate is the price of money. But if you can now demand and spend borrowing money for cheaper, more people will do it. And that will slightly stimulate a growth in demand for cars and other expensive items. It would also stimulate the housing market and create more wealth as house prices start to grow. What it would also do, though, is stimulate a growth in investment. Remember, investment is spending by firms on capital goods. So if borrowing is now cheaper for firms, then firms will borrow more to invest back into their businesses. So more C&I would create demand pull inflation, and that would therefore tackle those negative inflation rates across the economy. Now, even though this question says extracts A and B, I think it's worth showing you this data here. So this data was presented alongside this exam question when it was sat. Now, I want to point out here this high. So in October 2011, the inflation rate went as high as 5.2%. By the end of that time period, it fell to the low of roughly 0.5%. Now, it's worth remembering, everyone, that this is not deflation. This is disinflation in the economy. So we haven't got a fall in price levels, we've got a fall in the rate of inflation. So the growth in price levels are now starting to fall. Okay. Right, so just to go back to the question then, with reference to extracts A and B and your own knowledge, discuss whether the MPC should be concerned about the risk of deflation in the UK economy. Now, what I'd like you to now do is to remember that when you read a question, you should always do that before you read the extracts. That way, when you read the extract, you know what you're looking for in the data. So now I just want to go for review extracts A and B and point out some potential relevant application that we can use. So we've got here the Monetary Policy Committee, the Bank of England, is prepared to raise interest rates in the near future if inflation increases, one of its senior policymakers has warned. Christine Forbes, a member of the MPC, said a rise in borrowing costs would also be necessary should household debt reach unhealthy levels. However, she stressed that this was not yet a cause for concern. Right now, at the moment, there's nothing really here that's going to support my answer about deflation. But look at this next paragraph. The UK's base rate of interest is 0.5%. So I'll underline that, because I think that could be something quite useful that we can use to quote when we get onto our answer. Inflation is at a record low and expected to be negative. So we've now got clear reference that the MPC are concerned that there could be negative inflation rates, in other words, deflation, at some point in the near future. The MPC is currently under no pressure to raise interest rates despite Britain's economic recovery. UK inflation has been driven lower by a slump in global oil prices, which have roughly halved since 2014. And the bank's governor, Mark Carney, warned earlier this month that a strong domestic economy would translate into higher inflation over the medium term. Right, I'll underline that. I'll come back to that in a moment or two. The most likely next move in the monetary policy is an increase in interest rates. Right, now look what we've got here then. We've got some really useful information. It's giving us a reason why we've got a risk of deflation, a slump in global oil prices. Now what this will do, it would lower business costs if oil can now be bought for cheaper. So this would reduce cost push inflation. But then it later goes into saying this paragraph is actually, maybe we shouldn't be too concerned in the medium term about deflation, because the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is expecting inflation rates to pick up into the medium term. So next paragraph, Forbes said that even the more lagged effects of the rise in the value of the pound will likely peak in the first part of this year and also gradually fade. Inflation will then most likely bounce back. So again, it's suggesting that as time goes on, this risk of deflation will become less of a problem. And then the final paragraph, since interest rates take well over a year to be fully effective, they should be adjusted to respond to inflation risks at that time horizon, when all of these effects are diminished rather than respond to today's inflation. So all they're saying there then, everyone, is that when you set interest rates, there's a time lag. The impact of them might not be felt for a year or so. So with that in mind, when you set interest rates, you're not basing on what the inflation rate is today. You're thinking forward. So what will it be in a year's time? Right, extract B. Now, extract B is titled Deflation is Bad News. So again, let's go through this one together. The problem with deflation is that once you have it, you can't get rid of it. Well, that sounds quite useful. Central banks know what to do about inflation, but they do not have the policy tools to deal with deflation. That could be useful when interest rates are almost as low as they can go. Then it goes on to talk about Japan, which had deflation 9 separate years from 1999 to 2012, with 2 additional years at zero, averaging minus 0.3%. The highest in any single year was minus 1.3% in 2013. So it's telling us here then that Japan had lots of deflation and it went as low as a minus 1.3 inflation rate. Next paragraph, in the European Union in 1928, at the start of the financial crisis, there was fears of deflation, but at that time, the central banks had the ability to cut interest rates by nearly 5 percentage points. Right, okay, now what all it's saying here then is that when we had the financial crash, we had a big drop in aggregate demand. In Europe, they were able to massively slash interest rates to tackle that risk of deflation. So they raised aggregate demand by cutting interest rates. And then it goes on to tell us what is the risk of deflation now. So declines in energy prices. There's also deflation in non-energy industrial goods such as telecommunications. Then it goes to the collapse in the cost of shipping. Suggests something deeper is going on and may lead to a more persistent form of deflation. Right, now anyway then, let's now think about how we would answer this question. Now what we're looking for then is going to be 5 paragraphs. Now paragraph 1 should be really, really short and sweet. All I'm really looking for here is a definition of deflation. So to demonstrate some understanding about what deflation actually is. So all you would need to say is that deflation is when the economy experiences a negative rate of inflation. So the average or the general price level of goods and services is falling across the economy. You could link it to the UK, and you might say some of the reasons why this is happening. So from the extract, it talks about reasons could be a stronger currency. But then it talks about a reduction in the cost of global shipping. And it also talks about oil prices falling as well. So we've got there a good bit of application to back up that first paragraph. Now, paragraph 2, what I'm now looking for is one reason why MPC should be concerned about the risk of deflation. Evaluation would come in paragraph 3. So to what extent should they be concerned, or why should they not be concerned? Paragraph 4 would be a second reason why they should be concerned. And then finally, paragraph 5 would be an evaluation at that point. So remember, all paragraph 1 would be is that deflation occurs when we have a negative rate of inflation. So we have a reduction in the average or the general price level of goods and services. In the UK, this seems to be driven by a stronger currency, a collapse in global shipping costs, and a reduction in oil prices across the economy. Right, now let's now think about the nitty-gritty of this answer. Let's think about what to include in paragraphs 2 and paragraphs 3. So I'm going to think about what is my first reason why the MPC should be concerned. Now I'm going to quote the extract. Once you have it, it's difficult to get rid of. And to back up that statement, it's always useful to back up any kind of statement that you make. You could talk about Japan, that had ongoing deflationary problems from 1999 to 2012. So it seems to be a really persistent problem. So I'm backing up that statement. It's difficult to get rid of. Now, the reason why I'm going to say it's difficult for the UK to get rid of is that interest rates are already low at 0.5%. Now, normally what we'd recommend doing if we're in this risk of deflation, we would look to lower interest rates. And the reason why we would do that is lower interest rates would stimulate a growth in aggregate demand, and that would therefore raise demand pull inflation and take away the risk of deflation in the economy. Now, the problem we've got here, though, is if interest rates are already at 0.5%, they cannot go any lower. So remember, it says in the extract, in the financial crisis, the EU lowered interest rates by 5%. And that was a really, really effective tool at taking away that risk of deflation. Well, the problem here is if they're already at 0.5%, they cannot go any lower, which could be very difficult for the Monetary Policy Committee to actually get rid of this deflation. Now, to add a bit of bounce to this argument, though, it does say that in the medium term, this problem will go away. only seems to be a short-term problem. And the reason why I'm going to suggest that in the medium term to long term, this problem will correct itself. And the reason why is we've got, according to the extract, economic recovery that is already taking place. So if the economy is already growing, we'd expect in the medium term aggregate demand to grow anyway. And that will help ease these deflationary pressures that are taking place in the economy. So if I was using this information now to construct an answer, I'd say, well, overall, the first reason why the MPC should be concerned is that once you have deflation, it's very difficult to get rid of. So in other words, it's very difficult to bring back price stability. And a good example of this is Japan, that had deflationary problems from 1999 to 2012, which shows how persistent it is. And then I could say that normally what the MPC would look to do is to cut interest rates to stimulate aggregate demand to bring back price stability. A little bit like what the European Union did during the financial crisis by lowering interest rates by 5%. But the problem the Monetary Policy Committee have got is that interest rates are already at 0.5%. So there's very little scope to cut them even further. So the reason why the MPC should be concerned, is bringing it back to the link back to the question now, is that ultimately they cannot really cut them much lower. So the reason why they should be concerned ultimately is they might not be able to get rid of it. They lack the tools available to fix the problem, which could mean that we have price instability for a very long period of time. But then in paragraph 3, I'm adding balance to my argument. And I'm saying, well, however, from the extract, it does appear the risk of deflation only seems to be a short-term problem. In the medium term, for example, what we are expecting is for an economic recovery. So what we would expect is that GDP rebounds and starts to grow again, and aggregate demand will start to increase. And that would mean that price stability and growing inflation becomes a more likely scenario. Right, now I'm thinking about what to include in paragraph 4 and 5. So I'm now thinking about my second reason why they should be concerned about it. Now, what I'm going to go for this one is that we're at risk of a fall in consumer expectations. So what I'm using here is my own knowledge, which the question does allow me to do. Now, let me show you in a diagram what is happening. When you have deflation taking place, what we generally see is that people expect future reductions in price levels to become more persistent. Now, what this will do, it would lead to a reduction in consumption in the economy. So if people expect price levels to fall into the future, people will start to hold back on some of their consumption decisions. So people might delay buying expensive items if they think it's going to be cheaper in a few months. People stop buying houses because of drops in house prices, and that could mean that we have lower house prices, and that could reduce wealth. Now, as consumption rise, there will also be a reduction in animal spirits. So firms will see fall in demand, they'll see fall in price levels because of all this, and that will mean that their profits start to fall. Now, as profits start to fall, that will mean they invest less, but it would also mean they start to get rid of workers, which can create cyclical unemployment. And this could lead to a reduction in wage rates across the economy as well. So there are some real risks here then that could take place because of this risk of deflation. Now, in fact, what we've got here is something that we call a deflationary spiral. So again, let me put this together into a paragraph now. One reason why they should be concerned is that deflation will run the risk of ruining consumer expectations. If consumers fear reductions in price levels, then people will delay certain consumption decisions. so people reduce their demand for expensive items such as cars, but also it would lead to a reduction in the demand for houses. Mortgages become less accessible and people are less inclined to buy a house if property prices fall. This will therefore reduce wealth across the economy. Now, as consumption starts to fall, then firms' animal spirits will also fall. They've got falling demand for their goods and services, they're forced to cut prices, and this will make it more difficult to make profits. This will then lead to lower investment decisions by firms. Firms will also look to reduce spare capacity, so get rid of unneeded workers, and that creates cyclical unemployment. This would therefore force down wage rates and lead to a deflationary spiral taking place across the economy. But then, to evaluate this, I'm actually going to say, but we've got to look at the causes of deflation. And we would never really recommend that deflation is generally a good thing, but you could argue here that this has been driven by reduction in business costs. It talks about oil prices falling, shipping costs falling. It talks about lower energy prices. Now, what this is doing, it's forcing SRAS outwards. So what you could argue is that this is actually quite a good source of deflation to a certain extent. It's not been caused by a reduction in aggregate demand, but by a reduction in business costs. Now, what this will do, if you look at the diagram, it will actually raise aggregate demand. And that can actually help stimulate a growth in GDP across the economy. So we've got here that naturally, as deflation goes, it's not a bad source of deflation. It's driven by a reduction in business costs rather than by a reduction in aggregate demand. Now, let me just end this by giving you this full answer together. So I'm going to start off, remember, by saying that deflation is when we have a negative inflation rate. This therefore means that we've got a reduction in the general or the average price level across the economy. In the UK, it appears that deflation is caused by supply side factors. So we've got a collapse in global shipping costs, a reduction in oil prices, but also we've got a stronger currency, which will make imports cheaper to bring into the country. I'm then going to say the first reason why deflation is a concern is that it's very difficult to get rid of. For example, Japan experienced persistent deflationary problems between 1999 and 2012. It therefore appears that once you have it, it's very difficult to get rid of. And then I would say, for example, what we would expect to see is that when there is a risk of deflation, that there would be a reduction in interest rates to raise aggregate demand to bring back price stability. A little bit like what occurred in Europe in the financial crisis when interest rates were cut by 5%. However, the Bank of England have already got interest rates at 0.5%. This therefore means that the ability to further reduce interest rates is very difficult. This therefore suggests that the MPC, or the Bank of England, will not have the necessary tools available to them to raise aggregate demand to get rid of the deflation. This deflation is therefore likely to be around for a sustained period of time. But then evaluation, however, we can see from the extracts that the risk of deflation only appears to be a short-term problem. For example, in the medium term, the extract does mention there will be economic recovery. This therefore suggests that aggregate demand will start to grow and will mean that as time progresses, the risk of deflation will start to disappear. This therefore means that the MPC may be concerned about the short-term risk of deflation, but they shouldn't be concerned as we move into the medium to long term. Paragraph 4. Another reason why they should be concerned is because of the impact that deflation has on consumer expectations. When people get used to deflation in the economy, they start to reduce consumption. The reason why they do this is if they expect expensive products to fall in price, people delay consumption decisions. And this could, for example, reduce the demand for new houses. Overall, this will therefore force down house prices, but also the prices of expensive goods and services such as cars. Low house prices in particular would reduce wealth of households across the economy. As consumption falls, there will then also be a reduction in animal spirits. Firms will see profit levels fall due to lower demand, but also lower prices. And this will result in a reduction in investment, which will reduce aggregate demand in the economy. This will therefore mean that firms have now got spare capacity to look to reduce that by making workers redundant. This will therefore create cyclical unemployment and force down wage rates across the economy. We therefore have now a vicious deflationary spiral taking place in the economy. But then to counteract that, from the extract, we can see that the causes of deflation could actually be deemed to be good for the economy. Deflation has been caused not by a reduction in demand, but by a reduction in the cost of production. For example, as oil prices fall and global shipping costs fall, there'll be a reduction in the cost of production for firms. This will therefore shift the short-run aggregate supply curve outwards, and as we can see from the diagram, will actually raise aggregate demand and therefore promote more economic growth. So there you go, everyone. That is how we would answer this 15 marker. Just to wrap this up, you've got here now the mark scheme in front of you, and you've got here the different points that you could have given for why they should be concerned about deflation. Now look at some of the things that we've ticked off. We've talked about the risk of deflationary spirals. It's hard to escape. We've referenced Japan. We've talked about consumer expectations. We've also talked about the limited ability of the MPC to get the economy out of deflation. And then the final one we didn't mention, it's harder for the MPC to react to influence supply side factors. Now, what we could have been saying here then is that when we adjust interest rates, it's to influence aggregate demand. Well, falling oil prices has got nothing to do with aggregate demand. So there are certain things or certain causes of deflation that the MPC cannot fix or influence through interest rates. You've then got these possible evaluation points. So we mentioned this top one, it's only a short-term problem. It does appear that it will disappear in the medium term. Second one, it's caused by supply side factors, so reductions in costs. That's less of a problem than it would be if it was a demand problem. We've got the next one, we could have mentioned, it's only caused by a fall in the reduction in the price of certain items such as oil. It's therefore not necessarily widespread across the economy. Next one, the economy still seems to be doing quite well. So it suggests that it's not affecting consumer expectations. And then finally, it may benefit the economy. And that was the point that I mentioned in my diagram. If it's lower cost of production, it will shift out SRAS, and that will therefore stimulate a growth in GDP. So guys, hopefully that's helped you decide how you would answer a question such as this. So thank you very much for watching.